good timing coinciding with the end of the song there. So it is 11 o'clock, and I am happy to welcome everybody to our second session of the day and our final session of the 2021 Adaptive Management Forum. This is our closing plenary session called The Future of Adaptive Management, and I'm extremely excited to introduce our speakers today. A few quick reminders: please mute yourself and turn off your camera throughout the presentations. The link for our Adaptive Management Forum mural board is in the chat. Please do continue to engage on that space. It's been really fun to see people interacting and posting reactions and asking questions. That'll be open for another week. So please feel free to do what you'd like with that. I also posted the link to our survey in the chat. That feedback is extremely helpful for us, especially in designing the next forum 2 years from now. So please do take a few minutes to fill out that survey. It will be open through next Friday. The last reminder I wanted to give is that if you look at the Adaptive Management Forum agenda, this final session does run until 12:30 rather than 12. We're going to have 2 speakers, 2 plenary talks, and then we'll round it out with some closing reflections. Okay, so without further ado, I am really pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Letitia Grenier. Dr. Grenier completed her PhD at UC Berkeley, where her research concentrated on the ecology of the Bay Delta estuary system. Throughout her career, she's worked as a proponent and a leader of science-based management in the Bay Delta. She served as the science lead for the State of the Estuary report in 2019 and 2015, as well as the 2015 update to the Baylands ecosystem habitat goals, heading a team of over 200 environmental scientists, managers, and regulators to develop science-based recommendations for restoring and maintaining the health of the Bay's tidal wetlands in the face of rising sea levels and other stressors. Dr. Grenier and her team also developed the Delta Landscapes projects, which quantify landscape performance and provide science to support large-scale restoration visions for the region. In her current role as co-director of the Resilient Landscapes program of the San Francisco Estuary Institute, Dr. Grenier works with partners to conserve California's living resources by developing landscape-scale, collaborative, science-based visions and solutions. So please help me welcome Dr. Grenier.
Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to get to present to you today. This has been an amazingly good series of talks over the last 3 days. So I want to congratulate the organizers and also just say I'm so honored to get to talk to this community of people. You guys are fantastic, and it's given me a lot of hope to hear what you've had to say over the past couple days. I also want to acknowledge that what I'm going to talk about today reflects the work of many, many people, both within SFEI, where I work, and the larger community, where many of you work. I also want to acknowledge that I'm going to talk about some difficult truths, which I think we don't often say, but underlie our experience as people. And also even bring up a couple of emotions, which, you know, scientists were sort of culturally taught not to do that. But I actually think it's important and it matters, and it's something maybe that we should be talking about more, that this is perhaps part of the way that we bring people into our thinking. So to make it up to you, since I'm going to do those things, I'm going to have some nice pictures, hopefully. Hopefully they will be enjoyable while I say difficult truths. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Brandon, for advancing the slides. So I'm going to tell a story of when I started college a long time ago. And I happened to take this freshman course in ecology. I didn't think I was going to be a biologist, but I thought, that's cool, I'm going to take this course. And the very first thing that the professor said as we sat down to our very first class, she said, polar bears are going to go extinct in your lifetime. And that really got our attention. At that time, I don't think we were thinking about climate change in that way. It wasn't as concrete as until somebody said something like that. You know, that's a change that we can all understand and imagine. And if we fast forward now to 30 years later, polar bears are suffering, just as she said they would be, heading toward extinction, and we're all suffering. So we are reaping the unfortunate consequences of not doing a good job of dealing with the warnings that have been coming from science about climate change for a really long time. And I just want to acknowledge that that is emotionally challenging. The times we live in, there's a lot going on this past year or two, but also this bigger crisis that we're in is really difficult. But I think a lot of the way that I thought about this in my mind is that global crisis is kind of based on what's happening in other systems, in places that have these really important ecosystem services like tropical rainforests. They're getting cut down. They often have this really amazing biodiversity and these charismatic megafauna, and we see them suffering, and it's really hard. If you feel like being depressed, I think you should watch A Life on Our Planet, the first part. If you want to get some hope, watch till the last 5 minutes. But it's sobering to think about the biodiversity crisis that is layered right on top of our climate change crisis. And when I guess my recent realization about this is going like, okay, well, where does this matter, what we're doing to ecosystems? Where does it really matter? It matters in ecosystems that have really high ecosystem services that serve people as well as wildlife. And it matters where there's really high biodiversity. That's where you're going to get some of these big challenges in terms of biodiversity crisis and climate change crisis. That's where you have a big lever to make a difference. And as I was thinking about that, I was like, oh yeah, well, of course California is this biodiversity hotspot. This is one species, really cool salamander that looks different in all of the different parts of its range, trying to look like different salamanders and send different kind of signaling in its environment. You could hear a whole talk on that. It's super cool. So California is a biodiverse place. Wait a minute, we are kind of the tropical rainforest of Mediterranean ecosystems. And then I thought, well, okay, when we're working in the Delta, what are we working on? We're working on what used to be an enormous 500,000 hectare freshwater tidal marsh, mostly tidal, which is actually one of the most productive and ecosystem service rich ecosystems on the planet, second only to coral reefs, sometimes first, depends, but right up there at the top of the list. And of course, our particular marsh that we're talking about here is now a ghost of its former self, as you see in that picture. The spider web on the right is the ghost of the historical Delta marsh. It's what we have left today, about 2%. And so all of this made me realize that actually this emotionally challenging global crisis that I'm feeling all the time is part of what I'm doing in my daily work. You and I are engaged in the battle in a really important ecosystem, in a really biodiverse area, of trying to make things better by putting our ecosystems back together. And so I just want to acknowledge that, like, we're in this place. That's a hard place to be. And, we're marching toward Mount Doom with our friends, trying to save the world here. So something to think about. Maybe when it's hard to do our jobs, or we're super frustrated with how the challenges of getting things permitted, maybe this helps. We're slightly better off than Frodo Baggins, perhaps. So as we think about that on this blank screen, I just want to contemplate that what we talk about a lot in terms of climate change is the physics. What's going to happen with rainfall? What's going to happen with temperature? Things like that. What's going to happen with flooding? But there is this biodiversity layer on top of that crisis. So yes, I like physics. It's easier to be right. Even though the models are often complicated, they're still simpler than biological models for the most part, because understanding what's going to happen biologically is so complicated that we don't really know where the triggers and thresholds are for when the biodiversity crisis might really come back to bite us in the butt. And the truth is that tipping point, or that crisis, may get us before the physical crisis of climate change does. And I think we just need to keep that in mind, because that, to me, orients me toward a more holistic thinking about making our ecosystems work again, so that we can both help with the physical climate change crisis and the biodiversity aspects of our planetary crisis right now. We need to fix the whole system. Yes?
We have lost track of where we are in your slideshow. Can you please let us know what slide we're supposed to be on so we can get back in line with you?
I'm so sorry. Yeah, it's my bad. Go ahead, Brandon, one more. Yeah, was me. I totally messed up. This is me explaining about the loss of this big marsh and this high leverage system where we're all working. Next slide. And now we're just on, and here we are marching to Mount Doom together. Next slide. And I was just talking on a blank screen, so I'll try to remember. I was looking at the wrong window on my screen.
Thanks.
So thank you so much for breaking in, Chelsea. I appreciate that, or Karen. So we need to think biologically beyond delta smelt and salmon. We need to fix the whole system. And so to kind of update our thinking about climate change, we need to mitigate. We've been on that one for a while. Success is so far, but we're getting some momentum. We need to adapt, and we're doing that much more now. There were great talks about that, and the recent Delta Adapts report, we are moving toward that much faster. But we also need to rewild, which is one of the terms that's being used about how to fix the biodiversity crisis. So I want to expand our thinking to get to that place, because that's really a goal of having functional systems. Next slide. Okay, so I think this is my last difficult truth. Sorry, next slide. Next slide. Oh, Brandon, I'm so bad. Next slide. Okay. So my last difficult truth is that we need to take care of each other better while we're doing this. And I actually feel personally ashamed of my role in this situation, which is that we haven't done a good job around the estuary of including local communities in the thinking and the decision-making around how we restore our ecosystems. And I really took some of the movements of the past year or two, like Black Lives Matter, to bring this out, to bring to the forefront the inequity that exists around our communities right here in the Delta and the larger estuary area. And what's shameful to me about it is that we already knew this. So I've got a slide up here from the Cheetah Conservation Fund. Many decades ago, while people were trying to work on conservation in other parts of the world, they discovered that it is not effective, especially as somebody from the outside, to come and say, hey, you should stop killing cheetahs when they kill your goats. What is effective is to come and say, hey, I want to help you deal with this issue of having your goats eaten. I can offer you a trained dog that will protect your livestock, and then you won't need to kill cheetahs anymore. And that's really effective. And it also builds community and helps people understand their relationships with each other and the environment. And so if that lesson was known decades ago in other parts of the world, we should have been working on that harder in the estuary. And we're catching up now. But I just think it's good that we think about and acknowledge where we're starting from as people in part of a social ecological system. Next slide. So here's some information from the 2019 State of the Estuary Report, where we did our first equity-based analysis. And what we're looking at here is disadvantaged communities in purple and distant amount of park near where you live in green. I know it's hard to see, so don't worry, we're going to get to some summary information. Next slide. And if you look closely at the Delta, I just want to remind us all, there are these populations of disadvantaged communities right on the edge. Do these count as people who live, work, and play in the Delta? Maybe they would really benefit from being able to do that, but they can't because they have access challenges. So there's a lot of people who fall into this category. Next slide. And when we did the analysis across the entire estuary, what we found was there is a difference. So disadvantaged communities have only about 2/3 as much park area per person in their immediate area surrounding their house. And maybe those circles look similar in size to you, but if anybody wanted to offer you 2/3 the salary as somebody else or 2/3 the good health, I don't think you would appreciate that. I wouldn't. And there's a ton of research about how access to nature right in your community affects your physical health and your mental health and performance. So there's a vicious cycle here of disadvantaged communities also not getting the benefits from nature. Next slide. And I just want to show, this is a result from Santa Clara County, but the results are similar in Stockton and Sacramento. I just don't have a slide that shows them. And what this shows is that as you go up in annual household income along the x-axis, yes, there is more access to nature in terms of park area near your home, but there's still this disparity by race, no matter what income level. And it's pretty striking that that happens. Next slide. And it's also true in terms of canopy cover. So how much trees are, basically how much greenery, but really a lot of how much trees you have near where you live. And that's really important, especially in a place like the Central Valley and the Delta, where you've big problems with air pollution and also urban heat island effects. So these disparities, these injustices, I think really do matter. Next slide. And we need to think about that as we think about adaptive management and what our goals are. There was a lot of talk in the opening plenary around what our goals are. So I want to propose thinking about this at a very high level as putting ecosystems back together at the big scale so they provide the desired functions equitably across the landscape. And by desired functions, I mean the things that people want the ecosystem to do. We want ecosystem to support salmon and smelt. We want the ecosystem to not flood in the wrong ways. We want it to sequester carbon. We want it to deliver water. These are the kinds of things we want. And we need to hear from local communities what they want. We want to be able to go fishing, whatever the other issues are. We want access to nature. We want to be able to recreate. We need to put all of those functions into one conversation so that we can think about how do we maintain those functions over time or create them in a resilient way as the climate changes and other big changes happen. So let's just remember, it's not just climate change, it's also the biodiversity crisis, it's also the possibility of an earthquake. There's a lot that we need to be ready for, and probably the best way to create resilience in the landscape is to use natural processes. Natural processes are what makes ecosystems resilient. Next slide. So one of our challenges, I think, culturally is that we would like ecosystems to be static. We forget that they change, and they've always been changing, and that's what ecosystems do. So these lines show a change in the shoreline in Richmond, I believe this is, and that's happening now, and it's a problem for us when we have private property in a certain point or some kind of infrastructure that's between those areas of change. Next slide. But this is actually what makes these ecosystems so valuable to us, because as conditions change, they can adapt to it and continue to deliver functions. So this is a slide showing many of the different ways that marshes can change. They can move laterally, they can change vertically, and that they're still a marsh. And so if we can think of how to take advantage of this, if we can use this to our advantage to get the services we want and the functions we want over time, then we're going to be in a good place. But if we try to constrain the marsh, for example, and don't let it move, then we're going to lose the services that come with these ecosystems. So that's a big cultural shift in the way that we're thinking about it. And it's a challenge in the Delta, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, mainly because of the legacy situation we find ourselves in. Next slide. So there's been some talk about migration space and transition zone. If you look at the two maps here, you're looking at the historical versus the modern situation, where marshes, how they used to connect with terrestrial habitats, which was basically around the perimeter of the Delta, where they connected to different kinds of wetlands, oak woodland and grassland. And now on the right, and they also connected to the riparian areas where you had natural levees formed along the rivers from flooding. And now they connect in a really scattered way with levees, essentially. And so those are transitions to nowhere. That's what I often call them when I'm talking to people in the Bay. So we have to be really thoughtful about, if we're going to restore marshes, how can we make them valuable? You can see that Lindsay Slough there has a little black box around it where it's outlined. That's a valuable transition zone where you actually are connecting a marsh to an upland. But how are we going to do that everywhere else? The reason why it's so challenging is that's all about elevation, and connecting to those higher elevations means it probably puts natural resource restoration right in conflict with agriculture, where elevation is also really valuable. Next slide. And so if we look at the most high leverage places to put marshes, by which I mean the places where you wouldn't have to spend a lot of money or effort trying to get the elevation right before you've reached it to put a tidal marsh, and where you could put a big marsh that's going to be able to probably get a good channel network in it and deliver a lot of functions for fish, other wildlife, people, nutrient processing, carbon storage, etc. You're looking at the edge of the Delta. Next slide. And so if we're going to think about how to maximize benefits, we need to really think about, next slide, managing ecosystems holistically. So going beyond, and this is already happening, but it bears repeating, going beyond a couple of fish species, and thinking about what are all the other different benefits we get from this ecosystem, what are all the other wildlife we want to benefit from this system, what do people want to benefit from this system. Next slide. So putting that all together, next slide, at the big scale, which is hard to do, but as you've heard in these talks, we're starting to have the tools to be able to do this. Next slide. And that way we can trade off desired functions. And I think that's one of the key ideas to think about for adaptive management. We don't have to have every spot on the landscape deliver every function. If we're managing at the system scale, we can trade desired functions off over space, next slide, and over time. Next slide. So this is a lesson we heard from John Bourgeois and Donna Ball talking about the South Bay salt ponds. That project is so big that they could solve their problems by trading off functions over space. And if we think about over time, it's going to take time both for climate change to fully manifest, but also for natural processes to do their thing and give us benefits. And for example, for tidal marshes to move. So if we think over long enough timescales, we can also probably reduce the impacts of trade-off and increase the synergies. And we can start to think about, where do these curves over time intersect? Ag land value is going to decline as sea level rises. And there's a certain point at which it really might make sense to do certain kinds of restoration. So if we can think ahead of when those things are coming, we can do some really good planning. Next slide. And this has been termed ecosystem-based management quite a bit in the literature, and it's been successful in other parts of the world. We haven't been doing this for a very long time, but I think it's a good model to think about for how we think about implementing adaptive management at the large scale. Next slide. So Jeff Mount at PPIC with a bunch of co-authors, including me, recently produced a white paper on the topic of ecosystem-based management, and it gets into the details of what would be useful to change in the way we approach planning and governance. And that includes identifying the desired ecosystem condition and beneficiaries. That's essentially setting goals, which was talked a lot about in the original plenary session. So getting specific about those goals and having them be inclusive was also talked about a lot early in this process, early in this meeting. And then having good metrics and performance measures, including better accounting. And I think there's been a lot of progress on that with the ecosystem amendment to the Delta Plan, but really tracking how we're getting toward are these desired functions, are we maintaining them? Collaborative scientific support, and I think collaboration is a key idea that's been talked about across this conference. And then regulatory alignment and comprehensive agreements. This could even move toward more programmatic permitting. We have to be doing this faster, and permitting is such a huge problem. If there's a way that the agencies who are charged with environmental conservation and restoration can think about how to make it faster, we're really running out of time. By slowing things down, we may be causing more environmental problems than we'd be causing by permitting something faster. So it's a huge challenge to be thought about. And then reliable funding. There have been some interesting mentions of innovative funding approaches, but I think it's one of our biggest problems. Next slide. So some other thoughts about ecosystem-based management. How are we going to include sectors and communities? Next slide. There's some clearly in the most recent, next slide. Where can we get this inclusiveness of sectors and communities? Oh, through the Delta Science Awards. I went ahead of myself, sorry. So this most recent call for proposals really included a lot of good focus on getting more input from communities and understanding what people want from the Delta. How are we going to find tools to track change at the system scale and to plan that large scale system that functions the way we want it to? The Delta Landscape Scenario Planning Tool has been designed to do that. There were 2 workshops on this at this meeting, so I don't want to go into it in detail, but I do want to just point out it's based on science, it's transparent and standardized, which basically means it's a platform upon which we can create the menu where everybody's at the table and gets to say, I want this, I want this, I want this. And then we can think about the trade-offs and synergies in a holistic way. Next slide. Next slide. And that allows us to have these metrics clearly in front of everybody so that we have a common understanding, and hopefully we can build trust to find the solutions that we need to find. Next slide. And then as we do that, we can visually say to ourselves, okay, I get this much of A, B, and C in this scenario, and this much of A, B, and C in that scenario, and kind of do the horse trading that I think is ultimately going to be needed to get to a place where everyone feels like they've been part of the negotiation and made whole by the plan. Next slide. So what about a monitoring program and not monitoring projects? The IEP is out there and functioning, but I want you to be aware also of the Wetlands Regional Monitoring Program that's emerging from the Bay. And when I say the Bay, I mean that this also includes Sassoon. So there's this big area of overlap where we want to be thinking about using shared knowledge and tools. In fact, in general, we want to be thinking about using shared knowledge and tools across the estuary. So pay attention to the WRMP. The program plan is done. There's a lot of political motivation to get it funded and operating. Next slide. And thinking about innovation and experimentation, there have been so many great talks about this already. I almost hesitate to bring these up, but I do want us to remember that efforts coming from the Bay, which again includes Sassoon, which is part of the solution space for the Delta, have some really good stuff in them that could be useful to thinking about what to do in the Delta. And so I'll just go through the Baylands Goals recent update for climate change that's really relevant to this talk, but the adaptation atlas from the Bay is also really useful, especially if you're thinking about on-the-ground planning in Sassoon. So there were a lot of regional recommendations in the Baylands Goals update. This is about 200 people working together over 3 or 4 years, trying to figure out what should we do about our Baylands given climate change and the challenges it poses for us. And when I say baylands, I mean areas that would be covered by the tide if there were no levees. So by that, I mean pretty much that would include everything in the delta. The main difference in the bay is that this is oriented toward saltier ecosystems, but a lot of the lessons here are really similar. And so I'm just going to pull out a couple of key ideas. One is, I think in the delta, we need to think more about sediment. We need to think about inorganic sediment and the role it plays in resilience. How are we going to move inorganic sediment around with fresh water and get it to the places where we want it to be? And also organic sediment, which I think we have been thinking about more. How are we going to build peat? How are we going to use fresh water in a clever way to build peat and then use that fresh water again and then use that fresh water again? You know, that's what we can think about in terms of good landscape planning for the delta. Another thought I want to bring your attention to is item 6 here is about wildlife populations. Rather than staying in the small population paradigm, thanks Brandon, we really need to focus on giving wildlife more of a buffer. And that's what came out of the wildlife group that worked on the Baylands goals. With the changes and challenges that are coming through climate change, the more extreme events are likely to cause bigger impacts than we're ready for, unless we really focus on having bigger populations. Obviously, we're trying to do that with our endangered species already, but there is also everything else, everything that's not endangered already, or maybe hasn't been listed for some reason. We need to focus on that more holistic support of native biological communities beyond just a few species. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves in trouble with many other species as well as the ones we're already really focusing on. And then the last thing I want to focus on is number 9 here, transition zone. We've got to think carefully about where we can get valuable high leverage transition zones that really connects terrestrial systems to tidal wetland systems. If we only do this in managed wetlands, if we mainly focus on managed wetlands, and we're going to be limited in the central delta to what we can do, then we're not going to get the full suite of benefits. And if you think about it, we're going to be spending a lot of carbon to try to sequester carbon and to try to get these benefits. So always thinking toward what's the best way that we can take advantage of natural process and the options we have. And I realize that will be challenging. Next slide. So getting back to the title of my talk, which was trying to invoke this idea of willows, we got to figure out how to be the willow and not the road. That's the situation where we're at right now. We need to see change and things like floods as an opportunity that brings sediment and fresh water. How can we use that opportunity to put those things where we want them? Those are valuable resources. How can we be flexible and change and not be rigid? Because the change we're going to have from being rigid is going to be very challenging. I hope these were some helpful ideas to think about that. If next slide, we start to zoom out and think at the landscape scale. Next slide, it's always better to be the willow here than the road. We can think about creating a landscape where we have natural process, where we can have it, and fully functioning ecosystems like the riparian areas and tidal marsh you see in the central part of this imagined future. We can have a mosaic with managed wetlands like you see in the darker polygons near the river, near the slough there, where we're sequestering carbon, or at least improving greenhouse gas exchange as we convert from agriculture, and also providing maybe food for fish that's getting pumped out over the levee. And then maybe we're growing more rice, we're innovating with these cool pulsed flow actions that have been happening, and the floating wetlands that Steve talked about, and maybe new kinds of polluticulture, actually doing agriculture in wetlands. So the future is, I think it's possible to get there, but it's a big social change for us to think about how to collaborate differently and be more inclusive and think at the system scale and think holistically about biodiversity as well as just the physics of what's happening and a couple of endangered species. And I just want to say, this conference really gave me hope that we can get there because of all of you and what we're doing. And so I guess I really want to applaud this group and all of your work and say thank you so much for listening. And I hope we can go there together. Next slide. And feel free to get in touch if you have any. I'm sure I probably used too much of my time, but feel free to get in touch if you have any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Letitia. That was so wonderful. And we've spent a lot of time at this forum talking about sort of detailed practices and cogs of the adaptive management wheel, which has been insightful, but to scale back and have the big picture long-term perspective was a really nice compliment, just a great way to round out this forum, so thank you. We do have time for questions. We have about 5 minutes. And I see that there are already a couple in the chat, which I'll go ahead and read. One was from Sally Red. I believe this is just a clarifying question from earlier in your talk about the green space access. And she was asking if you know whether green areas overall, is that an average over everyone? And she was commenting that wouldn't it be even more if you look just at non-disadvantaged communities, the gap? Wouldn't there be more of a gap?
That is such a great question. And I'm going back to look at those data and think about that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. That would look more extreme if we did it that way. I think this was modeled. So this analysis was done by our urban ecology team. And I think it was modeled after the way these are commonly done, but I think that's a really interesting approach to maybe more clearly highlight the differences. So thank you.
Thank you. Yair, you wrote a question. Did you want to ask that one?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, just to elaborate a little more, Letitia, you talked about all these, again, it's a question of scientists or policymakers or a lot of people in this group in particular, quote, know what needs to be done. And the question is, well, how do we get it done? And we've known this, just like you mentioned, right, in your freshman year of college, you knew about it. And we're still not quite there. And I know it's a slow process, but how do we get this done? How do we get the social capital, if you would, to actually do these changes that we all believe and think really need to happen? Thank you.
Yeah, great question, Yair. Thank you. I think what gives me hope in terms of planning and adaptive management in the Delta, honestly, is this new call for proposals that are around human-focused interests. I think if we can get those more front and center in our thinking, that the group of folks who are making these decisions are going to care about what people want in the Delta. If we can be more inclusive about understanding those viewpoints, we can put them into different planning processes like the landscape scenario planning tool, and then everybody has a seat at the table. Miss Margaret, who we work with a lot in Oakland, who's a community organizer, likes to say, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. And so if the more we can provide a seat at the table to everybody in our individual areas of work and decision making, I think that makes a difference. At the bigger scale, like in our country and our planet, I don't know, I tend to be a little down on humans as a species. Like, we're pretty short-sighted and we're challenging. Maybe some people who are into psychology, like, I feel like we need to work at a different level in terms of psychology and communication. And it may not be the kind of folks who are us in this, like, who tend toward this kind of job, but it's like we need to get the spin doctors out there doing a better job on the side of protecting the environment. So if you know anybody like that, try to get them into that kind of thinking. Maybe you can influence their thinking.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Letitia. Stacy Sherman, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks. So Letitia, you mentioned the WRMP in the Bay and Sassoon Marsh. And I want to point out that we do have a wetland monitoring program in the Delta and Sassoon Marsh with the fish restoration program. So there are 17 current and future wetlands that we're monitoring now. And we have engaged with the WRMP, but the project objectives are kind of fundamentally different. So in the Delta, and specifically with the fish restoration program, we're really focused on food production for fish. And so we have a lot of metrics that center around secondary producers, the invertebrates. And that was omitted really from the WRMP. So how do you reconcile trying to marry things like that when it's the project objectives that really need to drive the monitoring?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I didn't mean to leave out the FRP. I think in my ignorance, I just lumped it mentally in with the IEP, so I apologize. I mean, the good news is I think those are really complementary programs. And so, maybe there's a way that they can fit together like puzzle pieces rather than overlapping. what I think the WRMP brings is this bigger, more holistic focus on marshes and their values and their ability to be resilient and essentially survive climate change. And I think that, you know, each of these programs has come from its historical perspective. So the Delta has been so focused on endangered fish. And honestly, the Bay has been super focused on endangered birds and mice that are in the marshes. So we just happen to have focused on different parts of the ecosystem and different values that it presents. So I think trying to find a way to dovetail those and see that there's value. You know, the Bay has this problem of never having really documented very well how the marshes support fish. And, you know, the work of the FRP can really help with that so that we don't have to recreate that wheel. And maybe the WRMP can provide some of this structure of the science framework for thinking about marsh evolution and survival with sea level rise. I hope that's helpful. I know the nitty gritty it remains challenging, but I think there's value in both perspectives and the histories that both of those areas bring. So I'm hoping that a complementary puzzle piece approach could work out in the long run.
Great. I am terribly sorry to cut this conversation short, but we unfortunately do have to move on. I saw Darcy Austin, you had your hand raised. You also put a comment in the chat. And Letitia, there are a couple questions and comments in the chat. So if you're able to access that and if you want to respond there, that would be wonderful. But thank you again. That was just really amazing talk and very incredibly inspiring. So we appreciate it.
Thank you.
At this point, I would love to introduce our second plenary presenter for today, Dr. Laurel Larson, the new Delta lead scientist. Dr. Larson is an associate professor in the departments of geography and civil and environmental engineering at UC Berkeley. She completed her PhD in civil engineering from the University of Colorado, and her areas of expertise include hydroecology, complex systems, environmental modeling, and restoration ecology, among others. Her research primarily focuses on how flowing water structures the form and function of landscapes. Dr. Larson has conducted research in the Florida Everglades, southern Louisiana, and streams and watersheds across the US, including coastal California. In addition to her appointment at Berkeley and her role as Delta lead scientist, Dr. Larson is a fellow of the Berkeley Institute of Data Sciences, an affiliate of the National Center for Earth Dynamics, and an elected fellow in the Geological Society of America. We already got to hear her briefly at the beginning of the forum, but now we have the opportunity to hear her reflect more at length on her vision for adaptive management over her tenure as Delta lead scientist and going forward into a future of climate change. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Laurel Larson.
Thank you, Chelsea. And let me just, hold on. Something strange happened when I was trying to share. Are you guys, okay, I think I should be sharing, and can you guys see my slide now?
No, we see your team screen.
Oh, I think I accidentally clicked on the wrong window because the windows moved around when I was in the process of clicking. So let me unshare and then try this again. Okay, how about now?
Now, if you want to just, there, perfect.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Well, this is a talk that will attempt to create a vision for adaptive management within the Delta of the future. As you know, I am a recent transplant to the Delta science community, so please forgive me if my positioning on the learning curve is glaringly apparent. I've learned a tremendous amount from this meeting, and I'm very much interested in your feedback on this assessment and this vision. Given our unique histories and trajectories, we all tend to view common challenges through distinct lenses. What I have to contribute today comes from viewing the challenge of landscape scale adaptive management of the Delta through the lens of our collective recent experience with COVID and the lens of my experience in the Everglades. Now, with respect to visioning adaptive management of the future, our ongoing experience with COVID suggests that we are already living in the future. Some say that sci-fi novels predicted the coronavirus pandemic with uncanny precision. The 1981 sci-fi novel, The Eyes of Darkness, for instance, made reference to a killer virus called Wuhan 400. And then the 2011 film Contagion featured a virus that jumped from animals to humans, resulting in a global pandemic. Regardless of the clairvoyance of futuristic fiction, events of the recent year have given the world a crash course on adaptive management. I plan to use this session to, if I might be creative with words, explore what the future of our present can tell us about the future of our delta. And the first lesson is that implementing adaptive management, even with high uncertainty and incomplete information, leads to rapid progress in understanding how the virus might be most effectively managed. Unfortunately, living here in the United States, a lot of that learning has come from failures of management strategy, but it is undeniable that the diverse array of experiments occurring throughout the world over the last year have produced useful, policy-relevant understanding of all of the strategies shown here. Now, of course, the world rallied to the cause of adaptively managing COVID because the alternative, doing nothing, would rapidly result in consequences that humanity would simply find unacceptable. In socio-environmental systems, though, there remains a stigma to being wrong in our modeled projections or management decisions, as has been discussed this week. Despite this stigma, we need to recognize that waiting for a more complete understanding or better models will exact a cost in human and non-human lives and well-being, and potentially the water supply for a huge segment of California, especially if that earthquake hits. We heard arguments yesterday from Stuart Siegel and Denise Reed about the need to take action now, as well as an argument by Letitia in the last talk. And our collective experience with COVID illustrates that we could achieve rapid progress by doing so. A related example that is often invoked about how proceeding with making decisions despite incomplete understanding of processes can be productive is that of weather forecasting. Initial forecasts half a century ago were pretty awful, but public demand for forecasts and improvement of those forecasts spurred learning by doing, in which evaluating why predictions were in error produced new insight that was then translated into the models and generated subsequent forecasts. So now a modern 5-day forecast is as accurate as a 1-day forecast was in 1980, and useful forecasts now reach 9 to 10 days into the future. A similar trajectory could apply to the models that underlie adaptive management. The second lesson is really preaching to the choir here, that monitoring leads to better outcomes of adaptive management. With COVID, models suggest that testing about just 10% of the population on a regular basis to detect asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic spreaders can reduce the peak of a flare-up by an order of magnitude. Of course, the elapsed time between sampling and behavioral decisions needs to be very short in the case of COVID, and this is also the case for being able to respond effectively to rapidly changing environmental conditions, but is a remaining challenge, as we heard yesterday from Denise Reed's talk. Now, yesterday in the permitting breakout group, we discussed options for exhibiting creativity and flexibility in the permitting process. The experience with COVID shows us how monitoring can enable us to take a course of action, such as avoiding a full lockdown that would be overly risky and unpermissible without the capability to respond rapidly to on-the-ground monitoring. This plot shows a model of intervention scenarios for Salzburg, Austria. The red here indicates, I'm trying to get my cursor, the red indicates a projection of COVID cases that would result from progressive relaxation of the lockdown starting in April of last year, while the blue shows the decline in cases expected if Salzburg remained in full lockdown. The green shows relaxation of the lockdown while implementing monitoring, contact tracing, which has an outcome statistically indistinguishable from the full lockdown case while avoiding the economic repercussions of the lockdown. Now, one of the things I'd like to point out about these modeling results is that they show uncertainty. Here, this uncertainty arises from randomness in the system, derived from how the simulated people interacted with each other. What this means is that for one of the other scenarios evaluated, an adaptive lockdown, in which, here it's shown in red, in which a threshold number of confirmed cases would trigger the lockdown conditions again, the outcome could be indistinguishable from the full lockdown if you look at the lower part of this uncertainty envelope, or it could result in a peak as high as the initial peak. So there are also a number of other cases in between, depending on how that randomness happens to play out within the system. This modeling also indicates, though, that the short term, that when we use a threshold for implementing a lockdown, you result in a short-term turning off and on of lockdown conditions, as indicated by the colored bars, and this wouldn't be a viable policy solution. I'd like to point out, though, that none of this insight would have been possible without scenario modeling, and ultimately the authors of this paper did recommend that a lower threshold for turning off and on lockdown conditions could result in a more favorable outcome. So this also brings up a broader discussion of uncertainty and what role it plays in adaptive management. I think it's important that we distinguish between two types of uncertainty here. First, there is uncertainty due to incomplete knowledge of the processes that drive system behavior. If we don't understand those processes, we can't represent them in our models. So while we could compare the outcomes of different hypotheses about how the system works, it might not be possible to estimate the full range of outcomes. Adaptive management, particularly at the project scale, can help resolve this source of uncertainty, for example, by addressing questions about how fish might move through different sizes of excavated channels. Second, though, is uncertainty due to randomness, which is in turn due to heterogeneity in the system, fluctuations in weather or climate, or microenvironments distributed across space. This uncertainty is a little easier to estimate in models by sampling from probability distributions over many different runs of the model, and it's typically what is shown as the uncertainty envelopes surrounding projections. While we generally do a good job of communicating this type of uncertainty, either as envelopes of uncertainty or probabilities of expected outcomes, scientists in general tend to do a poor job of communicating the first type to decision makers, as pointed out in a peer-reviewed discussion about policy-relevant communication of the science related to COVID cited here. In this paper, the authors make the distinction between science-informed policy and science-based policy, arguing that the latter terminology could be counterproductive. Essentially, their argument boils down to this. Because of fundamental knowledge gaps in the processes scientists are trying to model, there is low confidence associated with the probabilities of particular outcomes in the models. It is the responsibility of the scientists to communicate this confidence level to decision makers, who then need to weigh both types of uncertainty together with economic, cultural, and political factors to arrive at a recommended course of action. This is a decision that is informed by science, but not based purely on science, and transparency in the communication surrounding the decision could help lessen the stigma of making wrong decisions or wrong models that has been voiced here as a barrier to progress. The authors provide an example of such a communication strategy related to COVID, and the example is this. It would be language like, the result of the risk assessment is that the number of deaths is unlikely, less than 5%, to exceed X in the coming month, given the implementation of policy Y. This assessment is based on current knowledge on the topic about the best models and data available. There are, however, considerable uncertainties about the underlying phenomena and how the epidemic will develop. Many of the assumptions of the model used are subject to large uncertainties. Overall, the knowledge supporting the risk assessment is considered rather weak. So it's because of the number of factors beyond science that go into decision making that we have experimented with so many heterogeneous strategies to manage COVID throughout different localities, states, and countries worldwide. Foreman et al. Made an attempt to synthesize lessons learned from these diverse experiments, which, as we've discussed, is another step critical for system-scale adaptive management, of which I've highlighted just a few here. You'll notice that many of these key lessons are things that have come up here and are certainly relevant to the challenge of adaptively managing complex socio-ecological landscapes as well. In thinking about the challenges that we face in the Delta, I want to focus particularly on the points on decisive leadership, unified responses, and building trust for sound, inclusive decision-making as a way forward to developing adaptive management at the landscape scale. These points reminded me of what I had witnessed in the Everglades, and I think it would be productive to spend some time discussing how these concepts led to landscape-scale adaptive management in that system. Much of this story is unpublished or has only recently been published, and it developed after decades of criticism that adaptive management was not being practiced successfully in the Everglades. So today I'm going to be telling the story of the Central Everglades Planning Project, or CEP. CEP is not to be confused with SERP, which is the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan authorized by Congress in 2000 to the tune of $10 billion. CEP is the project within SERP that deals with getting the water right. It is a landscape-scale adaptive management strategy for increasing storage, treatment, and conveyance of water south of Lake Okeechobee, which is the big lake that you see here. Its actions include removing canals and levees within the Central Everglades, retaining water within Everglades National Park, and protecting urban and agricultural areas to the east from flooding. The SEP efforts were led jointly by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, tasked with the engineering design, and the South Florida Water Management District, tasked with the evaluation of hydrologic and ecosystem impacts. I believe that having a limited set of key lead agencies with well-defined roles was critical here. Most impressively, SEP was designed in just 3 years instead of the usual minimum of 6 for a U.S. Army Corps of Engineer project of this size. So how did they do it? Fred Sklar, director of the Everglades Division of the South Florida Water Management District, claims in a paper that I strongly recommend for anyone interested in landscape-scale adaptive management, that the expedited process was possible only because of the innovative participatory approach adopted in the planning process. The task force's working group sponsored a series of 16 public workshops to receive input from the public and keep them informed and engaged as active participants. At these workshops, stakeholders and partner agencies were introduced to the numerical models used in the planning process and invited to collaboratively develop scenarios and discuss the results of those scenarios. And this sounds very similar to what we've seen at the project scale here in the Frank's tract system and what Rod Whittier and Rosemary Hartman talked about in their presentations earlier today. In the Everglades, this process organically resolved long-standing conflicts among agencies with different, apparently conflicting objectives for restoration. Fred discusses many such examples in his book chapter, but I will highlight just 2. The first involves the Cape Sable Seaside Sparrow, which inhabits drier areas, outlined in black, on the margins of Everglades National Park and Big Cypress National Preserve that tend to be covered with spartina, sawgrass, and muley grass. The sparrow is sometimes known as the Goldilocks bird, as conditions have to be just right for it to survive. For years, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was resistant to proposals to send more water to Shark River Slough in Everglades National Park because of the threat of habitat loss for the sparrow. However, when the modeling tools were put in their hands, they were satisfied that lost habitat would be replaced with the creation of new suitable habitat conditions at slightly higher elevations without an accompanying loss of extent. With respect to a whole host of outputs, the models demonstrated a clear advantage for one of the scenarios considered, SEP 4 here, over a future without restoration and over the other scenarios. Wood storks gained habitat overall throughout the system, shown in the warm colors, while losing some ground locally, and fish density predominantly increased, shown by the green bubbles. However, the modeling demonstrated that even with the top performing flow scenario, not all restoration objectives, quantified here in the target habitat units, could be achieved. This number is not 100%. This was also a useful finding to emerge during the participatory process because it allowed acceptance that some restoration targets would need to be relaxed, which opened the possibility of other uses formerly perceived as conflicting. For example, all parties became comfortable with allowing for some parts of the northern Everglades to remain drained, supporting recreational deer hunting. This was quite a reasonable way to relax targets for creation of open water slough habitat because other models, including some models that I worked on, showed that these would have been very difficult to restore anyway once emergent vegetation was established. The result of the planning process was what you see here, flow objectives dealing with 4 boundaries within and surrounding the Everglades. Multiple agencies and stakeholders converged on the specifics of these objectives and the engineering design to achieve them through this set of workshops. Fred Sklar writes that the maze of models and associated performance measures that underlie this plan took decades to create. But once in place, it became possible to formulate a restoration design within just 18 months. I think the key message for us here is that integrated numerical modeling was essential to the success of the planning process in the Everglades. And an essential supporting tool was a virtual collaboratory, something that's been talked about a lot within this community. I'm including a few screenshots that provide information about the funding and partner structure of this collaboratory, as well as the types of interoperable models that are included within its scope. Now, it's also important to bring up that keeping to the adaptive management process, the implementation of this design will occur incrementally, starting with small-scale pilot projects and moving up to larger scales with evaluation and potential redesign checkpoints at each step. I was involved in one of these pilot scale projects, which actually predated/occurred in parallel with the SEP planning process. The DPM, or decompartmentalization physical model, was a pilot scale test of the restoration of sheet flow to formerly isolated parts of the Everglades via levee degradation downstream and installation of control gates in upstream levees through which flow pulses could be released. It was designed with a before-after control impact statistical design in order to test uncertainties about whether these pulse flow events could restore the sediment redistribution sufficient to maintain long-term slough habitat while minimizing phosphorus infiltration into the wetland. It also tested alternative engineering designs, namely whether cross-cutting canals needed to be backfilled for achieving connectivity. We encountered a nice surprise once the flow releases started. While we had used models to predict the flows needed for sediment redistribution, we predicted that these flows would be difficult to achieve in a practical manner for extended periods of time. We were not expecting that the flow, still just 4 centimeters per second, would cause the periphyton and FAV mats that natively occur within sloughs to lose their buoyancy and sink, clearing the water column and making the goal of sediment redistribution much easier to realize. However, there was some trade-off, as elevated phosphorus concentrations within the downstream marsh were sufficient to cause some shift in periphyton species composition, likely as a result of mobilization of phosphorus-rich sediments sourced from the upstream canal. This finding, together with the finding that backfilling canals downstream is needed to maintain or needed to reach a more desirable level of connectivity, led the team to recommend modifications for the much larger scale implementation of sheet flow restoration under SEP, including plugs in the canals and spreader swales downstream. Initially, the DPM project was slated for deconstruction at the end of its commission period after 2016. However, its success and its role in informing the design that ultimately went into SEP led to extended operations with extended funding for monitoring. This is another great example of how just doing it, even if a project initially seems disappointingly small in scope, can lead to better and brighter things down the road. As operations extended, the uncertainties that were experimentally tested also evolved. It particularly pleased me to see how monitoring the ecological effects of flow releases, explicitly pushed off the table initially because of funding constraints and the difficulty of doing so, have recently become one of the main focuses of the science team, with some exciting new results, such as a doubling of carbon respiration within sloughs with no accompanying change of primary productivity during flow pulses, which there is regarded as a good thing. Another contributor to the pleasant surprise of extended operations was flexibility built into the permitting that allowed for the refinement of the trigger for operating the experiment. To meet the 10 parts per billion threshold for phosphorus for flow releases into the Everglades, the operational window was initially confined to just November and December, based on historical data about phosphorus concentrations in the upstream canal from a nearby monitoring station. But as the project continued to collect data, a more sophisticated regression-based decision tree was developed that forecasted future phosphorus concentrations in the inflow and allowed for particularly long periods of operation in 2016 and 2018. These longer operations in turn enabled testing of effects of multiple serial flow pulses and extended flow periods. So where does this leave us? Perhaps these vignettes from the Everglades and COVID add some additional nuance to the adaptive management wheel involving specifics of how science should be communicated to decision makers and what goes into making decisions, including social and political factors. But really, I argue, we need an organized framework for thinking about what goes into landscape scale adaptive management. And here I give Dylan Chappell kudos for his conceptual diagram yesterday that showed that this emerges out of the aggregate of many of these wheels. Fred Sklar has a diagram that I think fits this bill particularly well, including 2 interwoven flow paths for converging onto a collective vision of the future and determining shared management goals, objectives, and strategies for evaluation. On the left over here is the design flow paths, where the visions that society creates are incorporated into models that include economic and legal constraints. Building relationships and mutual trust is what promotes progression through this flow path. On the right is the assessment flow path, where visions that science creates are incorporated into the pilot studies, monitoring, and experimental approaches needed to reduce the knowledge uncertainties associated with the project. According to Fred, these two flow paths are the yin and yang of landscape scale adaptive management, and both are integral to its success. So this in turn got me thinking about how socio-ecological systems like the Everglades and the Delta might get to the point of developing these flows in the first place. And I came up with a conceptual model of my own, which I see as potentially useful in helping determine which of the many adaptive management needs for this system we should prioritize over the next few years. So for this reason, I'm hoping to get feedback from you, as well as folks working in other systems like the Chesapeake and Louisiana. So I hypothesize that there are 5 phases that systems pass through in their adaptive management governance. The first phase, typically prompted by initial legislation, is a phase of building social and scientific capital. In this phase, the knowledge about key driving processes is initially low. There's a lot of knowledge uncertainty. And investments are primarily in understanding processes through experiments and models. Adaptive management projects are typically local in scale, but require some interagency collaboration, and the use of numerical models is focused either by geographic area and or by the output variable that's examined, such as flow or fish habitat. Interagency working groups might be established during this phase, but there remains a lot of dissent about goals and priorities of management. It is natural for this phase to take decades, as it did in the Everglades. I think our experience with COVID is an exception. In the second phase, scaling up, there's less knowledge uncertainty remaining. There have been many experiments to learn from. Many models are available. Stakeholder discussions are advanced, and stakeholders begin to engage with modelers in a participatory fashion. Agencies begin to find common ground, and there's some convergence around common goals. These common goals provide some impetus then to develop integrated modeling at larger scales or with more variables. Scenarios begin to be developed collectively. I propose that the transition to this stage is facilitated by strong leadership from an agency or an interagency group, such as an interagency modeling group. In the third phase, convergence, integrated modeling facilitates interagency and stakeholder discussions, and there's a convergence around a common strategy to achieve objectives. I propose that the transition to and from this phase might be rapid once the organizational architecture from phases 1 and 2 has been built. Then in the fourth phase, you enter a phase of implementation and refinement. Transition from phase 3 to phase 4 might require legislative authorization by an assembly or another state body, but it can be facilitated by having an incremental approach to implementation. As implementation progresses, you begin to resolve some of that randomness uncertainty that comes from not knowing what sort of temporal sequencing of weather patterns an area is going to receive, or features that are local to particular sites. So once you start implementing the project, this uncertainty becomes decreased and is an important stimulus for refinement. And then I envision that there is some interchange between phases 4 and 5, where phase 5 is a phase of rapid response, where agencies develop the capability to do operational forecasting. And this really requires both access to readily accessible, rapidly updated data, and also to cyber infrastructure for integrating that data into models. It also requires the forecasting process itself to undergo iterative refinement that then can feed into an adaptive management cycle. And you could read more about Michael Dietz's vision of this in a PNAS paper that came out in 2018. Now I do have some, before I get to the next slide, I want to mention that the way I see it, system scale adaptive management really begins to evolve in phase 2 and becomes quite pronounced in the convergence, implementation, and refinement and rapid response phases. So I do have some concluding thoughts. but I don't want to impose them on anyone before I seek feedback. And I want to do so in a structured way. So I'm going to, with Chelsea's permission, commandeer a little bit of the question and answer period to do a Mentimeter activity that I hope will stimulate some questions and comments. Is that okay with you, Chelsea?
That is perfect. Thanks, Laurel.
So please go to menti.com and use the code that's showing here. Very curious to see what phase of adaptive management governance people in this group think the Delta is currently in. And I think when you go to your screen, you should be able to see the figure to remind you of what each of those phases are. Let me know if that's not the case, and I could show it here.
Yes, it's appearing on screen.
Okay, great. And the intermediate choices are, we could be transitional between phases, so feel free to select an intermediate if you don't think we fit neatly into one of those phases that I described. So I'm not sure if this is supposed to refresh on my computer. Let me, I do have this on a web browser too, so I will share that with you. And we'll see. Of course, now it's starting to be very slow. Okay, let's see what it comes up with. Okay, a lot of people think that we're transitional between phases 1 and 2 right now. And that's actually, I share those thoughts, but it's interesting. Some people think that we're in the 5th phase or in the 4th phase. So there's quite a diversity of responses here. The second prompt I would like to give you is, I'm trying to get to my next slide. I seem to be having maybe some bandwidth issues here. Okay. How would you rate your reaction to the proposed phases of adaptive management governance for socio-ecological systems? So there's a slider bar here where if you strongly disagree, you think that this schema misses the mark completely, pick something in the middle of the road if you agree in principle, but would revise some of the details, and then strongly agree is this gets it mostly right. Okay, great. Well, I encourage everyone to share some more thoughts in the mural. I do have one more prompt that I'm not sure I want to spend a lot of time on, given that we're eating into our Q&A period, but feel free to go ahead and visit this as well. This is an open-ended prompt to submit comments about the proposed phases of adaptive management governance. And I can let those kind of come through while I wrap up with a few concluding thoughts. So I could actually come back to that. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint presentation so that you could see my last few slides. So I do think that we're on the right track with approaching the transition into system scale adaptive management or landscape scale adaptive management within the Delta. There have been a number of efforts recently that put us onto that track, including the Social Science Task Force, the Science Action Agenda Participatory Process, the Performance Measures Dashboard, data transparency efforts, some of the huge efforts that have been going into the component models and local scale adaptive management projects to reduce science and engineering uncertainties. And some good examples are the Dutch slough and Frank's track restoration, which of course went through a participatory modeling process very similar to what I described for the Everglades. So I think it's natural that the first phase can take a really long time before systems transition into the second phase, but I do think we're well on our way. But what we really need at this point is more integration of models with each other at the landscape scale, and more integration of modeling efforts with efforts to build social capital. ultimately with the outcome of collectively developing and testing scenarios. To me, it seems that these two things should be our top priorities as a community for the near future. Now, clear communication of uncertainty and risk is needed to build the trust that is foundational to system scale adaptive management and lay the foundation for action despite remaining uncertainty. And it is important to continue to develop data dashboards, for instance, that report on real-time status of performance measures, and also to do deep learning and put together AI tools and pathways for user-friendly data integration into models to be ready for a rapid transition to that final stage of system scale adaptive management. So with that, thank you for sticking with me to the bitter end, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and comments and seeing the feedback online and on Mural.
Thank you so much, Laurel. That was really thought-provoking vision. I'm certainly looking forward to seeing where the conversation goes from here. I also really appreciated you contextualizing this year that we've had with the pandemic. So timely and topical, and I think that it's a great example of what Stuart was talking about yesterday, taking advantage of lessons that just happen to crop up along the way and deriving knowledge that we can from them. So thank you. I think we have time for maybe one question, if anybody wants to chime in. Nobody wants to take that window. I will jump in with one of my own, which is going back to earlier in your presentation, you were talking about the difference between types of uncertainty. And I guess I was just curious to hear your reflections about communicating scientific uncertainty, particularly against the backdrop of what I would characterize as kind of this assault on science that we've seen in recent years, kind of a distrust of science and of facts, really. So do you have any experience or recommendations for communicating uncertainty kind of in an accurate and responsible way, but also one that doesn't continue to undercut or undermine kind of the credibility of science? Oh, I think you're on mute, Laurel.
Thanks for that question, Chelsea. It's a good question and a really difficult question to answer. I do think this is something that the scientific community at large struggles with. Now, by the way of an answer, I think I would kind of go back to that suggestion that I had on my slide that came directly out of the paper written by risk science researchers. So I think it's important to make a distinction between probabilities of particular outcomes that are estimated using the best available science, but then also to make a statement about the level of confidence associated with the models that generated those probabilities. And I think the IPCC actually does a pretty good job of this type of communication in their latest outputs on climate change projections and impacts on ecosystems. I think that part of this becoming more receptive towards science also involves hearing this sort of communication style again and again. So I think as a scientific community, we need to be consistent with how we talk about uncertainty and how we talk about levels of confidence. And I do think that there's some weight to the argument that it might be counterproductive to present decisions as science-based, because then if those decisions end up having surprises associated with the outcome, particularly unpleasant surprises, that casts aspersions on the science that went into informing those decisions. So, this might be a controversial thing to say in this group, because I do think that the Delta plan even mandates science-based adaptive management. But I think we do need to be careful to make the decision, or to make the distinction that it's really science-informed adaptive management. And there are a host of other considerations that go into making the decisions. And we're basing the decisions on best available science, which is incomplete.
Thank you for that. And like Laurel mentioned, please do feel free to use the Mentimeter or mural board to continue this conversation. And yeah, that was, like I said, extremely thought-provoking and a great compliment to Letitia's talk and a great capstone to the forum. So thank you, Laurel. At this point, we're going to round it off with some closing reflections. And I will hand it to Karen.
Awesome. Thanks, Chelsea. So we've just about reached the end of the 2021 Adaptive Management Forum and thought it would be nice to close with some reflections. I've asked Chelsea to join me and share some of the time so she can provide some of her thoughts too. Chelsea is a relative newcomer to the Delta system, joined the Delta Science program in July of last year, but she's been co-leading the planning of the forum with me since basically her first day on the job. So I think she has a unique view of both the breadth and depth of what we attempted to cover in our 3 days together. And I'm going to hand it off to her to make some remarks, and then we'll be sharing the rest of the talk.
Yeah, thanks, Karen, and thank you for the opportunity to reflect back on this forum. It's really been an educational and enlightening experience for me. My hope is that I can reflect back on this forum with the unique insights of both an insider and an outsider to adaptive management in the Delta. You know, from the inside, bringing a more in-depth or at least growing understanding of details and practical considerations and real-world concerns, but also from the outside, surrounding adaptive management and its significance. So in early discussions with our planning committee for this forum, we talked about framing the forum to follow a narrative arc of adaptive management in the Delta. So it's a story that spans from past to present and now continues onward into the future. In revisiting the historical development of adaptive management in the Delta, the goal was to help us understand where we are today by learning about how we got here. And we heard from Phil Eisenberg, the founding chair of the Delta Stewardship Council, about the policy context for Delta science and management. He outlined a history in which litigation and political battles were the key drivers of policy interpretation, implementation, and enforcement. And he observed that adaptive management out of the various facets of the Delta Reform Act and the Delta Plan has remained something of a puzzle, to use his word, a practice that's required in a regulatory sense, but that hasn't been tested by litigation. And I found myself thinking a lot about that proposition that adaptive management will reach its fullest potential only once it survives some sort of a Delta socio-political crucible, and also wondering if that is the case, whether that'll happen at the dais of the Delta Stewardship Council or in a courtroom or elsewhere, perhaps. Moving forward too fast. In the next plenary talk, Dr. Michael Healy traced the intellectual origins of adaptive management to the 1970s, so half a century ago. And in his talk, we heard how adaptive management developed both in and outside the Delta. We learned how the framework of adaptive management in the Delta has itself been adaptively managed, with the obstacles of early adaptive management informing how the concept and practice evolved under the CalFed Bay Delta Authority, and how the Blue Ribbon Task Force took lessons from CalFed to create the Delta Reform Act, which then required the development of the Delta Plan and the framework we currently use for adaptive management in the system. And I think it's amazing to see how much continuity there is between these frameworks that Mike showed us from the Ecosystem Restoration Program, CalFed, and the Delta Plan. And it's also kind of incredible to think how far we've come in evolving our institutional awareness of the core principles. As Mike told us, practices like conceptual modeling and even monitoring were not widely practiced 30 years ago. Whereas now, though we may be challenged to implement these practices, I think it's fair to say their value and significance are widely recognized, especially by practitioners of ecosystem restoration. And so I find it interesting to ponder what we'll observe 30 years from now. You know, what practices will seem to push our boundaries, will be commonplace, and what will be on the next horizon. But we'll get to the future in a bit. For most of the forum, we considered what we can learn from work that's happening on the ground right now. You know, clearly we have a lot to learn from the past, but there's also a lot to learn from the present. We have a vast compendium of experience and knowledge and an arsenal of tools that are developed within the framework of adaptive management. These are resources that are constantly expanding as we continue to practice and improve adaptive management in the here and now. So much of the forum was dedicated to how we go about the work of adaptive management today. And so we thought it would be worthwhile to spend a little time revisiting what we learned. In presentations and workshops, we heard about experiences, tools, best practices, and lessons learned from various aspects of the adaptive management cycle.
Sorry, muted. Many presentations address planning for adaptive management. In my overview of the first session, I discussed the importance of robust planning efforts to anticipate a range of outcomes and think strategically and collaboratively ahead of time about how to respond. Following my introduction, we heard about several specific approaches to adaptive management and to data management plan development. In the afternoon workshop, Adaptive Management Planning 101, participants worked in small groups and used a short project description to create the bones of their own adaptive management plans. First, they articulated the goals of the project and then chose one goal and came up with several measurable objectives. For each objective, the team predicted outputs and outcomes and developed monitoring metrics, triggers, and potential management responses. What you see on the screen is just one example of what a group came up with in our hour together. In the presentations, workshop, and on the mural board, we had some common observations that can be summarized as key takeaways for adaptive management planning. These include the importance of clear communication among project proponents and with external or public stakeholders, the need to remain flexible and go with the flow, the benefits of receiving early input from a range of stakeholders. My talk, for example, covered a few of the main venues that facilitate this process, and the importance of being methodological in how data is collected, managed, and shared. We also discussed some of the newly available resources that support adaptive management planning, many of which can be found on or linked from the Interagency Adaptive Management Team website.
Another new tool we just now heard about from Letitia is the Delta Landscapes Scenario Planning tool, which is a map-based tool that can be used to support project or landscape scale planning for adaptive management. And in addition to that little snapshot we got today, yesterday and Wednesday, we also hosted afternoon workshops that were led by a truly fabulous team from the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and they provided more of an in-depth overview. As you just heard a little bit from Letitia, the tool has the capability to assess the multiple benefits of land use activities and compare between scenarios. One of its greatest potentials, I think, is that the tool can be used for project or parcel scale analysis, but it's also designed for more holistic landscape scale planning. In the afternoon workshop, we got a behind-the-scenes look at the tool's capabilities, walking through how to design and run scenarios, and also how to interpret output. There's a lot of interest in using the tool to evaluate trade-offs and help set priorities. And in breakouts, we also brainstormed additional functionality users might like to see in the tool. Some ideas range from quantification of restoration costs to integration with other Delta cyber infrastructure to analysis of wildlife-friendly farming, to give you just a small sampling. This tool is available publicly online now as a resource to the Delta community, and it will also be updated with expanded and improved functionality over the next year and a half, so keep an eye out for those changes. The forum also highlighted a host of other processes and tools that support other stages of adaptive management in addition to planning. We called these mechanisms. As Annika Keeley just explained in her overview, these are the nuts and bolts that keep the cycle moving forward. In this session, we heard about how CVPIA uses structured decision-making to determine priority actions, how DWR is using pilot studies to test experimental methodologies of controlling aquatic vegetation, how a clear conceptual model lays a strong foundation for the entire adaptive management cycle, and how quantitative models can be used for estimating the magnitude of outcomes. Finally, we heard about some resources and best practices for funding adaptive management from the Delta Conservancy.
Many of us spent Thursday afternoon exploring the intersection of permitting and adaptive management. Permits also fall under the mechanisms umbrella, but perhaps function less as tools than as gateways, bridges that have to be crossed to move from planning to implementation. The workshop provided an opportunity for participants to hear about permitting challenges and strategies from the perspectives of funders, regulators, and project proponents. And then we used a World Cafe style rotation discussion to dialogue and brainstorm on how to successfully navigate incorporating adaptive management into the planning process. The presentations by different agency representatives about approaches to permitting adaptive management showed that adaptive management is on the radar of the regulatory agencies. But in the breakout discussions, it was also evident that there are a lot of questions on the best approaches. Here's a glimpse of a section of our mural board, which we filled with great ideas during the workshop. A few recurrent ideas for successful permitting of adaptive management included an appreciation for adaptive management within the regulatory agencies and an ability to use broad language in permit conditions, projects engaging early with different regulatory agencies, and the careful development of trigger points of adaptive management actions that can be baked into permits. Once plans are filed and permits obtained, it's on to implementation and evaluation, the stage where the adaptive management loop closes. In his overview talk, Stuart Siegel outlined 2 ways the loop can close, with intentional, preconceived planning, and we heard from several presenters on how they do that, or by learning opportunistically. To take advantage of past and ongoing projects, Stuart advised us to focus on usable knowledge. To do the best with what we have on the landscape, consider sites that are representative and have established research programs, and select monitoring metrics based on clear and concise conceptual models. Another resounding takeaway I drew from both presentations and conversation on the mural board is the need to have not just adequate funding, but also adequate staff explicitly dedicated to the work of planning, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. To put it plainly, the loop isn't going to close itself. Not only is it important to address the various constraints that prevent learning and adaptation from occurring, but it's also important to ensure financial, administrative, and human resources are in place to move the wheel forward. In the Surprises and Successes session, Dylan Chappell emphasized the importance of synthesizing knowledge and lessons learned. Then, we featured a whole set of examples with presenters sharing their experiences moving between doing, learning, and responding adaptively. A couple of surprises were stories of unexpected species arriving at restoration sites and how the ongoing management of the sites has had to be adjusted in response. And a couple of successes, we heard about the eradication of invasive spartina around the bay, which has promoted populations of ridgeway rails, and successes at Sonoma Creek, where vegetation has recolonized previously stagnant ponds, mosquito populations have decreased, and wildlife habitat has developed.
And so returning to our narrative arc, we also spent some time at the forum looking to the future and anticipating challenges ahead. For this stage, I'm reminded of a song lyric, and this is going to be a bit of a generational departure perhaps from our earlier playlist. But the song lyric is that every plan is a tiny prayer to Father Time. For a bit of fun, if you know the band, drop it in the chat. But this comes to mind because in many ways it does feel like we're at the whim of time, addressing the immediate needs and concerns of today while knowing in the back of our minds that the future is coming, and it's a future filled with changes that may arrive sooner or later, and they may come on suddenly or incrementally, and they may be both unexpected and unprecedented. As Laurel observed in her opening plenary, we are certain that the future is more uncertain, and as Stuart emphasized later, time's taken away. Fortunately, we have more than prayers as we plan for the future. So we heard just now some phenomenal ideas from Letitia and Laurel, excuse me. Letitia outlined a far-reaching strategy for ecosystem-based management, which included new tools, monitoring programs, and experimentation and innovation supported by smarter permitting and more funding. Together, she outlined an inspiring vision for a more holistic systems-based approach to conservation planning and management that will promote resilience in this complex Bay Delta system as we move into a changing future. And then Laurel echoed some similar themes, emphasizing the importance of a transition to more system-scale thinking to support landscape-scale adaptive management to address the future challenges and uncertainties. Laurel described her sweeping vision for adaptive management in complex socioecological systems, outlining a governance frameworks that would eventually build the capacity for near real-time response to changing conditions. And then she also recommended some concrete practices like integrated modeling, data accessibility and sharing, and stakeholder participation, many of which are already underway and can continue to be developed to support more coordinated, cooperative approach to adaptive management. And so here we are in the midst of this living history as it unfolds. And one question this forum has crystallized for me is, how do we balance or integrate lessons learned from the past with projections for the future to inform how we go about the work of adaptive management today? All of us here are writing this story, and this moment in time is full of exciting opportunities, but also immense challenges. Venues like this Adaptive Management Forum are critical because they bring people together from various roles and organizations to coalesce as a community where we can summon our collective skills and knowledge to continue this story. My hope is that one day, looking back in the clearer light of history, our story will take a form we recognize as progress. And if you ask me, our best bet of realizing that hope is by sharing and listening and working together. On that note, I am going to sign off. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I'm going to hand it back to Karen, but first I'm going to give one more plug for the mural board and also for the Post-Adaptive Management Forum survey. I will post that link in the chat and also email it later. So thank you.
Thanks, Chelsea, for those parting words. And I'm going to close now with a whole bunch of thank yous. So thank you to my staff, Chelsea, Dylan, Annika, and Cheryl, for a ton of work that you did to put into making this forum happen, and all the work that you do year-round to implement ideas from venues like this and use them to improve the practice of adaptive management in our system. Thank you to our planning committee members for sharing your ideas and donating your time to make this forum better and help us think more broadly about adaptive management across the Bay and Delta than we could have done on our own. Megan, Yair, Kate, Stuart, Rachel, and Aaron, you have all been amazing. Also, a huge thanks to all of the people who helped us put on the afternoon workshops, from planning to facilitating to note-taking. There are simply too many of you to name you all, but thank you. And finally, an enormous shout out to Brandon and Eric from our meeting services team, and Brittany and Geneva from our comms team. None of this would have been possible without your support. Thank you for being prepared for every contingency, for being responsive on the fly, and somehow managing to help us run multiple simultaneous breakout groups in workshops, help participants with tech issues, and navigate a bunch of last-minute adjustments with my team. You're incredible. Thank you so much. And finally, thanks to all of you participating for being here and being part of the conversation. As Chelsea said, I hope you take a few minutes to fill out the forum survey. You've got the link, but we'll also send it out in email. It provides us really important feedback and should only take you about 5 to 10 minutes. Thank you.